An elderly man threw his loyal K9 German Shepherd from a 15-story balcony. But what happened next will leave you speechless. After a miraculous rescue, the dog fights to survive, while his owner battles his own demons. Can this dog ever forgive the man who betrayed him? Or is it too late for redemption? What happens when loyalty faces betrayal? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more heart-stopping stories. The wind was sharp and biting that cold morning in Montana, carrying the first hints of winter's chill as it swept through the sparse trees that dotted the rolling hills. In the small town of Silver Creek, nestled in the heart of the countryside, stood a sprawling house. Its once gleaming windows now stared out like lifeless eyes. Weary from years of watching over a man and his dog, their stories written in the shadows of the rooms they inhabited. Martin Turner, a retired Navy veteran, lived here alone. His home had once been filled with laughter, warmth, and the sound of footsteps that now echoed only in his memories. Martin Turner was a man of stoic demeanor, standing at just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that had once carried the weight of military armor and responsibility. Now, at the age of 73, his body had begun to betray him. His hair, once dark and thick, had faded to a salt and pepper mix, his face lined with the map of his long and tumultuous life. His eyes, however, remained sharp, blue like the unyielding ocean, reflecting both the wisdom of age and the pain of countless untold stories. For over a decade, Martin had served alongside his loyal companion. A German Shepherd K9 named Max was a strong and noble dog, with a sleek coat of black and tan that glimmered under the sunlight. His golden eyes always seemed to be searching, always alert, always loyal. They had been through thick and thin together, weathering the brutal challenges of war, and each carried the scars of their shared history. Max had been injured in the line of duty, a bullet wound that left him with a limp, a permanent reminder of their service in Afghanistan. But even as his body grew weaker, Max's spirit remained unwavering. The two were bound by an invisible thread, their connection forged through years of shared adversity. However, life after service was not kind to either of them. Martin, plagued by the shadows of PTSD and the silent whispers of memories long buried, had become a man consumed by grief. The horrors of war, the death of comrades, and the harsh realities of transitioning back to civilian life wore down his resolve. Alone in the house that had once been filled with laughter, Martin's mind began to fracture under the weight of his past. And Max, his only solace, was growing older, slower, his once mighty frame now more frail with age. It was on that fateful morning, when the wind howled like a wolf outside the house, that Martin made the decision that would change everything. Standing on the edge of the helipad atop his home, he gazed out over the endless expanse of Montana's rugged landscape. The town below was still, silent, like the calm before a storm. And in his heart, Martin felt the burden of his years, the loneliness, and the crushing weight of his past. He turned to Max, who stood by his side, his eyes wide and trusting. "Buddy," Martin muttered, his voice thick with emotion, "it's time. You've been a good dog, but you deserve peace. More than I could ever give you." Max tilted his head, as if trying to understand the words. His ears perked up. Martin's hands trembled as he knelt down, caressing the dogs for one last time. The decision had already been made. In a single, heart-wrenching motion, Martin threw Max off the edge of the helipad, the dog's body plummeting through the air. Max's scream echoed in the wind. The moment was surreal. Martin stood frozen, his chest tightening, a wave of regret washing over him. He hadn't wanted to hurt Max. He had only wanted to end the suffering, Max's and his own. But as the dog fell, a part of Martin's heart fell with him. The finality of the act hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no going back. Down below, a teenage boy named Daniel was skateboarding through the neighborhood, the cold breeze brushing against his face. He had no idea that his day was about to change forever. As he skated, he looked up, catching a dark blur in his peripheral vision. His heart skipped a beat as he saw it. The figure of a dog, falling from the sky, its body twisting in midair before hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with disbelief. He sprinted toward the source of the noise, his breath coming in short bursts as his heart raced. He found Max lying on the ground, his body twisted and broken, blood pooling around him. The dog's chest was still moving, slowly, faintly, but it was alive. Barely. "Somebody help!" Daniel screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He knelt by Max, his hands trembling as he tried to check for signs of life. Max's eyes flickered open for a brief moment, and in them, Daniel saw not just pain, but betrayal. He felt a lump form in his throat, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Who could do something like this? The dog that had served so bravely, now lying helplessly on the ground. Daniel pulled off his hoodie and wrapped it around Max, trying to keep him warm. "Please don't die. Please don't die," he whispered over and over, hoping for a miracle. Seconds later, the building's security guard arrived, a man named Jeff. His face turned pale as he took in the scene before him. "What the hell happened?" Jeff muttered as he immediately radioed for help. The whispers from the onlookers began to spread. The old man up there threw him from the top floor. Within moments, the paramedics arrived. They worked quickly to load Max onto a stretcher, securing him carefully. The dog's body was a patchwork of broken bones and bruises. But as they prepared to take him to the animal trauma center, there was one thing that kept tugging at their minds. The look in Max's eyes before he passed out: betrayal. At the trauma center, Dr. Sarah Miller stood by, her fingers poised over her clipboard. The exhaustion from a long shift weighed heavily on her shoulders, but when the gurney with Max was rolled in, all thoughts of fatigue disappeared. She immediately took charge, her medical instincts kicking in. She knelt beside the dog, her eyes scanning his body for the extent of the injuries. "Who did this?" she murmured to herself, glancing at the paramedic who accompanied the dog. "Someone threw him out of a building?" The paramedic nodded gravely. 15th floor. "It's a miracle he's still alive." Dr. Miller gently ran her fingers through Max's fur, her heart heavy. "This is no ordinary dog," she whispered, her mind racing. The injuries were severe, but there was something more, something about Max that seemed familiar. As she examined the dog further, she noticed the faint outline of a tattoo beneath his fur. "A military dog," she whispered. "A retired K9. Sarah knew that Max had a story, one that needed to be told. But first, she had to save his life. The early afternoon sun filtered through the clouded sky, casting long shadows across the streets of Silver Creek. A soft wind rustled through the trees as Daniel sprinted toward the lifeless body of Max, his heart racing. The sound of his footsteps pounding against the pavement was deafening in his ears as he reached the spot where the German shepherd lay motionless on the cold ground. He knelt beside the dog, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. Blood pooled beneath Max's body, and the sight was almost too much to bear. But then, just as Daniel thought all hope was lost, he saw it. Max's chest was still rising and falling, faint but steady. The dog was still alive. "Max," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. He gently stroked the dog's fur, trying to comfort him, his mind racing with fear and confusion. How could someone do this to a dog? Max, who had always been so brave and loyal. The tears threatened to spill from his eyes, but he held them back. He couldn't lose Max. Not now. "Somebody call 911. Daniel screamed, his voice urgent. He looked up to see the gathering crowd of onlookers, some frozen in shock, others dialing their phones. The small town of Silver Creek had never seen anything like this before. The whispers began to spread. "The old man up there. He threw the dog." As the crowd began to murmur, a familiar figure appeared. A man named Jeff, the building's security guard. His face was pale, and his eyes widened in horror as he took in the scene before him. He quickly reached for his radio, calling for help. "Stay with him, kid," Jeff said, his voice steady despite the shock. "Help is on the way." Minutes felt like hours as Daniel stayed by Max's side, his hands trembling as he tried to keep the dog warm. The dog's shallow breathing was the only sign that Max was still alive. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder until they were almost deafening. The paramedics arrived, moving quickly to secure Max on a stretcher, their expressions grave as they assessed his injuries. "Get him to the Animal Trauma Center," one of the paramedics instructed, his voice sharp. "He's not out of the woods yet." Daniel reluctantly stepped back as the paramedics took control, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. He couldn't understand why someone would do this, especially to a dog who had served so valiantly. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't let Max die. The drive to the Animal Trauma Center felt like an eternity, but finally, they arrived. Max was rushed inside, the medical staff quickly springing into action. Dr. Sarah Miller, the lead veterinarian, was already waiting. She had been working at the center for over 10 years, her reputation as one of the best in the field well earned. But even she felt a pang of dread as she looked at the dog being wheeled in. She had seen many injured animals over the years, but there was something different about this one. His body, battered and broken, told a story of sacrifice. Dr. Miller was a tall woman, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her green eyes were filled with determination. She was known for her calm demeanor in high-pressure situations, but as she surveyed Max's condition, a sense of urgency swept over her. The dog was in bad shape. Fractured ribs, a shattered leg, internal bleeding. He had survived the fall from an impossible height, but the damage was extensive. She leaned down and gently touched Max's face, her fingers tracing the familiar scar on his ear. It was a mark that spoke of his past, a reminder of the service he had given. A military dog, she realized, her heart sinking as she remembered the tales of soldiers and their K-9 partners. She had treated a few military dogs in the past, but this one, Max, was different. There was a bond, a connection between them, even though they had never met before. "Let's get him stabilized," Dr. Miller ordered, her voice steady. "We need to stop the bleeding and assess the damage to his internal organs. I want a full workup, everything." As the team worked to stabilize Max, Dr. Miller stood back, her mind racing. She couldn't help but wonder about the dog's past. What had happened to him? How had he ended up in the hands of someone who could treat him like this? The thought gnawed at her as she watched the dog's chest rise and fall, weak but steady. Meanwhile, outside the trauma center, a group of concerned townspeople had gathered, waiting for news. Among them was Daniel, who had been the first to find Max. He was pacing nervously, his mind racing with questions. He couldn't shake the image of Max falling from the sky, the look of betrayal in the dog's eyes as he hit the ground. "Do you think he'll make it?" one of the bystanders asked, her voice filled with concern. Daniel paused, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have to believe he will. He's strong. He's been through worse. I'm sure of it." Just then, a car pulled up and a man stepped out. It was Jason, the local detective, known for his methodical approach to every case. He was a tall man, with a square jaw and a stern expression. His brown eyes scanned the crowd as he approached Daniel. "Is he still alive?" Jason asked, his voice low. Daniel nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Barely. He's in there, but I don't know if he's going to make it. They said it's touch and go." Jason placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, offering him a rare moment of comfort. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly. "We'll get to the bottom of this." Inside, Dr. Miller and her team worked tirelessly to save Max. She had seen animals with worse injuries, but there was something about Max that made her determined to fight for him. She knew he had been through hell, and now she would do everything in her power to make sure he didn't have to face the ultimate sacrifice. As Max's condition slowly stabilized, Dr. Miller stood at his side, watching the dog's labored breathing. She gently placed her hand on his head, feeling the warmth of his fur. "I'm not going to let you go," she whispered. "You've been through enough." But as Max lay in the recovery room, the mystery of his past loomed over him. Who had done this to him, and why? These questions would have to wait for another day, as Dr. Miller focused on the immediate task at hand, saving Max's life. The quiet hum of the Animal Trauma Center was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in Dr. Sarah Miller's mind. Max was stable now, his breathing steady, and the worst of his physical injuries had been addressed. Yet, there was something lingering in the air, an unspoken question that had begun to consume her thoughts. Why would anyone throw a loyal dog from such a height? Who could hurt an animal who had given so much in service to others? More importantly, who was the man responsible for this? Sarah stood in the dimly lit recovery room, gazing down at the German shepherd lying motionless in the crate. His once proud stance had been replaced by the vulnerability of a wounded animal, but there was something about him that commanded respect even in his injured state. Max was not just any dog. She could tell. His scars, his demeanor, the way his eyes seemed to know things others couldn't. He had a past, a military past, and she needed to understand it if she were going to help him. She couldn't ignore the nagging question any longer. Who was the man that had pushed him to this point? Sarah had already contacted the local police, but something told her the answers wouldn't come easily. As much as she had seen in her years as a veterinarian, nothing could prepare her for the weight of what had just happened to Max. Sarah's eyes shifted to the doorway as Detective Jason Rowe stepped into the room. He was a tall man in his late 30s with sharp features that conveyed both authority and fatigue. His dark brown eyes were focused, his jaw set in determination. But there was a softness to him that made Sarah feel like she wasn't just talking to a lawman. She was speaking to a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Jason had been a soldier once, too. She could see it in his posture, the way he carried himself, like someone who understood the gravity of a battle, even if it wasn't fought with weapons. "Any updates?" Jason asked, his voice low but filled with an unspoken concern as he approached her. "Max's condition is stable," Sarah replied, "but I can't help feeling like we're missing something bigger. Why would anyone, especially a man with such a history, do this?" Jason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Max, his eyes narrowing as he processed the situation. After a moment, he sighed deeply. "There's something I need to show you," Jason said quietly. "Something that might help you understand more about the man behind this, Martin Turner." Sarah's brow furrowed. "You know him?" Jason nodded. "I've been looking into him. He's not just some old man with a dog. Martin Turner is a former Navy vet, and he's been struggling with PTSD for years. But what's more troubling, he was paired with Max for years. The two of them served together. Max was his partner in combat. You know what that kind of bond does to a person, don't you?" Sarah looked at Max, feeling a pang of empathy. "I don't understand," she admitted. "If he loved him, why would he do this?" Jason hesitated, then began to speak again. "PTSD can do things to people that they don't even recognize. They push people away, they lash out. It becomes so overwhelming that it feels like there's no escape. Martin's not in a good place, Sarah. He's been isolated, living in that house alone for years, fighting his own demons." Sarah felt the weight of Jason's words settle in her chest. She had worked with enough people who had struggled with trauma to understand that sometimes the people they hurt the most were those who loved them the most. It was clear now. Max had been more than just a pet to Martin. He had been a lifeline, a companion through the darkest days of war and beyond. And yet, that very bond was what made it so tragic. "Where can I find him?" Sarah asked, her voice firm. "I need to talk to him." Jason gave her a hard look, and then he sighed. "I'll take you to his place. But I'll warn you, he's not going to be easy to talk to. The last time I tried to approach him, he was volatile. He doesn't even recognize what he did anymore. It's all a blur for him." Sarah nodded, understanding the risks. She needed to help both Max and Martin. They were both victims of a world that had chewed them up and left them to survive however they could. She wasn't sure what she could do to help, but she was determined to find out. The ride to Martin's home was quiet, filled with the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the road. The further they drove, the more the landscape changed. The town of Silver Creek slowly faded into the distance, and the countryside stretched out before them. Wide open spaces, tall grasses swaying in the wind, and the occasional cluster of trees dotting the horizon. Martin's house was located on the outskirts of town, a large, dilapidated farmhouse that looked as though it had once been a place of pride, but had now become a symbol of isolation. The house itself was dark, as if it were locked in its own world, far from the life it once had. Jason pulled the car into the gravel driveway, and the two of them got out. Sarah's gaze moved over the property, taking in the silence that seemed to hang in the air. Jason led the way up to the porch, where he knocked firmly on the door. After a few moments, the door creaked open. Martin Turner stood in the doorway, his frail form hunched slightly, his weathered face hard and unreadable. His eyes were pale, almost glassy, but they held a depth of sadness that was impossible to ignore. The years of isolation had worn on him, leaving behind a man who looked decades older than he was. "What do you want?" Martin's voice was raspy, his tone defensive. "We need to talk." "Martin," Jason said gently. "It's about Max." At the mention of the dog's name, Martin's eyes flickered with something, guilt, pain, perhaps even recognition, but it was fleeting. He opened the door wider, stepping aside to let them in. The inside of the house was just as bleak as the outside. The furniture was sparse, worn, and covered in a fine layer of dust. Sarah could tell immediately that Martin had not taken care of himself, or the house, in a long time. His mind seemed to be somewhere far away, lost in a fog of memories he couldn't escape. "Why did you do it, Martin?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but direct. "Why did you throw Max?" Martin looked at her blankly, as if the question hadn't quite registered. He sat down heavily on an old chair, running a hand through his graying hair. I didn't mean to," he muttered. I thought he was attacking me. I couldn't think straight. The pain, the noise, it all gets too loud sometimes." His voice trailed off as he looked down at the floor. Jason and Sarah exchanged a glance. Martin wasn't making any sense, but it was clear that whatever had happened, it was rooted in the trauma he had suffered over the years. The guilt was eating away at him, and he didn't know how to cope with it. "You're not the only one suffering, Martin," Jason said gently. "Max is suffering too, but he's still here. He's alive. You need to face what happened, for both your sakes." Martin's eyes welled with tears. "I never wanted to hurt him," he whispered. "He was the only one who stayed. He was the only one who never left me." The cold light of the morning poured through the windows of the trauma center, casting long shadows across the sterile white walls. Sarah Miller sat in her office, her fingers tightly gripping a pen as she stared at the papers in front of her. It had been hours since Martin Turner was arrested, and her mind felt clouded by the weight of the decisions ahead. The authorities had taken him into custody, charged with animal cruelty, but she couldn't help but feel conflicted. Martin wasn't a villain, at least not in the way the world seemed to see him now. He was a man broken by the horrors of his past, someone who needed help, not punishment. The trauma center was unusually quiet, with only the low hum of machines in the background as Max lay in the recovery room, his body heavily bandaged. Despite the severity of his injuries, the German Shepherd was showing signs of life, his chest rising and falling, his eyes blinking slowly. Max was a fighter, but the question still lingered in Sarah's mind. Could she save him? Could she save both him and Martin? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She glanced up to see Daniel, standing in the doorway, his face drawn with worry. The young boy had been the first to find Max, and had stayed by his side throughout the ordeal. He looked exhausted, his usual energy now replaced by a deep concern. "Sarah?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper, filled with a quiet desperation. "I don't know what to do. Mox." He's hanging on, but it's like he's waiting for something. Like he knows something we don't. Sarah stood up from her desk and walked over to him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. Daniel was a good kid, kind, with a big heart, and he had a connection to Max that ran deeper than anyone could understand. His bond with the dog had been evident from the moment he had rushed to his side after the fall. But now, Daniel's worry was palpable. The weight of the situation had hit him harder than she had expected. "I know, Daniel," she said softly, "but we have to be strong for him. And for Martin, too." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "But how can we help Martin? He threw Max from the roof. How can you defend someone who did that?" Sarah took a deep breath, her expression hardening with resolve. "Because Martin didn't do it on purpose. He's sick, Daniel. He's been living with PTSD for years, fighting battles that none of us can imagine. And I believe he's just as much a victim here as Max is." "I just don't get it," Daniel muttered. "Why would he hurt Max? Max was the only thing he had left. Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She didn't know why Martin had done what he did, but she knew that he wasn't beyond saving. Not yet. The real challenge now was convincing the authorities to see that. Meanwhile, just outside the center, a group of social workers, law enforcement officers, and city officials had gathered to discuss what should be done next. Among them was a woman named Victoria Harris, a no-nonsense social worker in her mid-40s with short, cropped blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. She was known for her tough stance on animal rights, but there was something about her that made Sarah uneasy. Victoria had a reputation for being relentless, and her view on Martin's actions was clear. He needs to be held accountable, Victoria said firmly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. What he did to that dog was unforgivable. He's a danger to society, and if we let him off the hook now, we're setting a dangerous precedent. Sarah, who had been observing the conversation from a distance, felt a surge of frustration. She knew that Victoria wouldn't back down easily, but Sarah also understood that she wasn't dealing with just a criminal here. Martin was a man lost in the aftermath of war, struggling with a mental illness that had taken away everything he once held dear. "I understand your concerns, Victoria," Sarah spoke up as she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "But you're not seeing the whole picture. Martin doesn't need punishment. He needs help. I've seen what PTSD can do to people, and it's not something you can just fix with a punishment. He needs treatment, not a jail cell." Victoria's sharp gaze shifted to Sarah, her expression unchanging. "And what about Max? What about the dog who nearly died because of this man's actions?" She shot back, her voice rising in intensity. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "Max is alive, and he's going to make it. We can't save him by throwing Martin away. They've both been through hell, and now they need to heal together." The conversation became heated, with others joining in to voice their opinions. But the situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and Sarah knew that if she didn't act fast, Max might be taken from the center, and Martin might be committed to a psychiatric ward, never getting the chance to recover from the trauma he had endured. She needed a solution, and she needed it fast. Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in the break room, the weight of the decision hanging heavy on her shoulders. She knew that she had to act quickly. If the authorities took Max away or sent Martin to a psychiatric hospital without treatment, it would only make everything worse. She needed to make them understand that this wasn't just about a dog or a man. It was about giving them both a second chance. She stood up abruptly, her decision made. She walked over to Daniel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, lost in thought. "Daniel," she said, her voice resolute, "I need your help." Daniel looked up at her, surprised. "Help? How can I?" "I need you to come with me," Sarah interrupted gently. "We're going to visit Martin." The ride to Martin's house was tense, with Daniel sitting quietly in the passenger seat, his hands folded in his lap. Sarah's mind raced as she prepared herself for the confrontation that was coming. They arrived at the house shortly after, and Sarah took a deep breath before getting out of the car. Jason had warned her that Martin wasn't in the best state of mind, but Sarah was ready to confront him. She needed to show him that he wasn't alone, that he still had a chance to make things right. Martin answered the door after only a brief knock, his face a mixture of exhaustion and guilt. His eyes flickered with recognition when he saw Sarah, but his posture was slumped, defeated. "You came back," he said quietly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm here because we need to talk, Martin," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "Max is still alive, and he's still fighting. But you need help. You can't do this alone anymore." Martin's face twisted with anguish as he stepped back, allowing Sarah and Daniel inside. He sank into a worn chair, his hands trembling in his lap. "I don't know what happened," Martin whispered, his voice breaking. I thought he was attacking me. The noise, the memories, they come at me like a flood." "I know, Martin," Sarah said gently, kneeling in front of him. "But you're not alone anymore. Max isn't just a dog. He's your partner. And you're both going to heal. Together." The evening sky was a deep shade of violet, the last slivers of sunlight fading behind the jagged peaks of the mountains that surrounded Silver Creek. Inside the Animal Trauma Center, there was an unnatural stillness in the air, broken only by the soft beeping of machines and the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Sarah Miller stood at the edge of the recovery room, her eyes focused on Max, the dog who had already been through so much. His condition had improved, but it was still touch and go. His breathing had stabilized, and his fractures were slowly mending. But the last hurdle remained. Max had not yet regained full use of his back legs, and there was a persistent limp in his stride. And with that limp, Sarah knew, came the possibility of further injury, possibly permanent. Her heart was heavy with indecision. She had spent countless hours with Max, tending to him, observing his progress, and fighting for him. She had seen the bond between him and Martin Turner, and she knew that, in many ways, the dog was as much a part of Martin as his own soul. But Sarah was torn. Should she allow Max to return to the one person who had betrayed him, or should she protect the dog from the potential danger of being with a man who was still battling his own demons? Sarah glanced over at Daniel, who had been her steadfast support throughout the ordeal. The young boy was sitting in the corner of the room, his face a mask of worry. He had developed a deep bond with Max, a bond that had started from the moment he first laid eyes on the dog falling from the sky. Daniel had witnessed the worst of it, the fall, the injuries, the blood. But he had also seen the strength in Max, and he had believed from the start that Max would survive. Sarah, Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to face him. Is he really going to be okay? I know you're trying your best, but what if we're doing the wrong thing? Sarah's eyes softened. I don't know, Daniel. I wish I had an answer. But we have to be careful. Max has been through so much already. He deserves peace, but he also deserves a chance to heal. And that might mean he has to be with Martin. Daniel stood up and walked over to her, his expression serious. But what if Martin? What if he can't keep it together? What if Max gets hurt again? Sarah's gaze drifted back to Max, who lay quietly in the recovery crate, his eyes half closed. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a sense of comfort in the familiar environment of the center. But even with the progress he had made, she couldn't ignore the underlying risk. Max's recovery wasn't guaranteed, and the fear of another fall was never far from her mind. She had to make a decision. The tension was unbearable, and the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. A few hours later, the decision became far more urgent. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls of the trauma center, and Sarah turned to see Martin standing in the doorway. He was thinner than she remembered, his once sturdy frame now reduced to something fragile and broken. His clothes hung loosely on his body, and his face was gaunt, eyes hollowed by the emotional and mental toll of the past weeks. His once proud posture was now slumped, and there was an air of desperation around him that made Sarah's heart ache. I need to see him. Martin's voice was hoarse, laced with emotion. He looked past Sarah, his gaze fixed on Max. His hands were trembling as he stepped forward, his expression full of both guilt and hope. Please, I need to see Max. Sarah's chest tightened. She could see the pain in Martin's eyes, the rawness of the grief that seemed to consume him. She had known from the start that Martin was a man on the edge, teetering between redemption and despair. But seeing him now, standing before her, she couldn't help but feel a surge of empathy for him. He had suffered so much, and Max, his loyal companion, had been his only constant. How could she deny them the chance to be together again? But what if she was wrong? What if Max wasn't ready? What if Martin's pain led to another outburst, another betrayal? Sarah shook her head, tried to push the doubt from her mind. Martin, I don't know if it's the right time, she said gently, her voice steady but uncertain. Max is still recovering. He's not the same as he was before. I can't risk his health or yours. Martin's eyes filled with tears. I'm not asking you to take him away, he whispered, his voice cracking. I just want to see him. I just want to apologize for what I did. I didn't mean to hurt him. I thought he was attacking me. I wasn't myself. His voice faltered, and he looked away, wiping his face with his sleeve. Sarah watched him closely, her heart torn. She could see the raw pain in his expression, and for a moment, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for both of them to heal. But the fear still lingered. The fear that Martin wasn't ready, that Max wasn't ready. It was the fear of something that could never be undone. Before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his voice surprisingly calm. "Sarah," he said, "maybe we should give him a chance. Martin's been through a lot. He needs Max, and Max needs him." Sarah turned to look at Daniel, her brow furrowing. "Daniel, he's right," Martin interrupted, his voice quiet but determined. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just need to make things right." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll let you see him," she said softly, "but only for a few minutes. And you have to understand, Martin, Max needs to be safe. He needs to be able to heal." Martin's face softened with gratitude, and he stepped toward Max's crate. He reached out a trembling hand, and for a moment, neither he nor Max moved. Then, slowly, Max's ears perked up, and he lifted his head. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and in that instant, everything seemed to change. The years of service, the battles fought, and the pain of betrayal, all of it melted away as Max cautiously approached Martin. Martin knelt down, and Max, with his broken body, gently nuzzled against him. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. The bond between them was undeniable, a silent understanding that transcended words. "I'm sorry, Max," Martin whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, everything was still. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, it all seemed to fade into the background. There was no noise, no judgment, just the quiet moment between a man and his dog. As the moment passed, Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest. She still wasn't sure if this was the right decision, but she knew that sometimes healing came in the most unexpected forms. Max had been the one constant in Martin's life, and maybe, just maybe, it was time for them both to heal together. But as Sarah turned to leave, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, challenges that she couldn't predict. But for now, she let herself believe that, for Max and Martin, redemption was still possible. The sky was painted in hues of gold and pink as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains of Silver Creek. A warm, gentle breeze swept across the small town, stirring the leaves in the trees and carrying the scent of wildflowers through the air. It was the kind of evening that felt like a fresh start, the kind that promised new beginnings after a long, painful chapter. Inside the Animal Trauma Center, Sarah Miller stood at the window of her office, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the decisions she had made and the paths ahead. The hardest decision had already been made. Max, the brave German shepherd who had been through so much, would be cared for by an animal sanctuary, where he could live out his days in safety and peace. But what about Martin? The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. Martin Turner, once a man who had been defined by his PTSD and the unrelenting weight of his past, had taken the first steps toward healing. After much negotiation, he had been given a chance at recovery, provided he entered a treatment facility for his mental health. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the beginning of something better, something Sarah hoped would give Martin the opportunity to reclaim his life. But the path ahead was still uncertain, and Sarah knew that the journey of healing wasn't linear. It would take time, patience, and a great deal of courage, for both Martin and Max. As Sarah stood there, lost in thought, the door to her office creaked open, and Daniel stepped inside. The young boy had been with Max every step of the way, even in the moments when hope seemed fleeting. His bond with the dog was undeniable, and it had been Daniel who had first encouraged Sarah to give Martin a second chance. Now, as he stood in front of her, his face was a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with both hope and hesitation. "Is it really over for Max? I mean, he's going to be okay, right?" Sarah turned toward him, her heart aching for the boy who had grown so attached to Max. "Yes, Daniel," she replied softly, her voice reassuring. "Max is going to be okay. He's going to live out the rest of his life in a safe place, surrounded by people who understand him and can care for him. He deserves that peace." Daniel nodded, but his eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "And Martin? Will he be okay too?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting to the photos on her desk of a life she had once hoped to build for herself. A life full of comfort, certainty, and joy. It was hard to reconcile that vision with the life she had now, one shaped by the decisions she had made in the past few weeks. The reality of what had happened, the trauma, the pain, the loss, was impossible to escape, but there was a glimmer of hope for both Martin and Max. It would take time, yes, but Sarah believed they both had the strength to rebuild. "Martin is in treatment now," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "He's not going to be alone anymore. He's going to get the help he needs to heal. It's not going to be easy, but he's taking the first step. That's all anyone can ask for." Daniel looked relieved, though the weight of the situation still hung over him. He had witnessed the worst of it, the fall, the injuries, and the pain, but he had also witnessed the recovery, the healing, and the bonds that had been forged in the aftermath. He knew that Max and Martin's story wasn't over yet. The next day, Sarah stood outside the animal sanctuary where Max would begin his new life. The facility was nestled in a quiet, peaceful valley, surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests. It was a place of healing for animals, a sanctuary where they could find comfort and care after a life of trauma. Sarah had visited it before, and she knew it was the right place for Max. The staff here were kind, experienced, and dedicated to providing a peaceful, loving environment for animals in need. It was everything Max deserved after everything he had been through. As Sarah watched the van pull up to the entrance, she felt a pang in her chest. Saying goodbye to Max wasn't easy. She had grown attached to him over the past few weeks, and the bond they shared had been one of mutual respect and understanding. But she knew it was the right thing. Max needed to be in a place where he could fully recover and live out his days without the burden of trauma. Sarah felt a soft tug at her heart as she watched the sanctuary staff unload Max from a vehicle, gently lifting him onto a soft bed and taking him into the facility. "You'll be safe here," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Max. "You'll finally get the peace you deserve." As she watched Max disappear into the sanctuary, she couldn't help but feel a bittersweet sense of relief. This was the closure Max needed: peace, safety, and a chance to live out the rest of his life in tranquility. And for Martin, this was the beginning of his journey toward redemption. It wouldn't be easy, but Sarah was confident that, with time, Martin could rebuild his life and find peace too. Several weeks passed, and Sarah kept in touch with both Max's new caretakers and the treatment facility where Martin was receiving care. Martin was making progress, slowly but steadily. He had begun attending therapy sessions, and he was taking responsibility for the actions that had led to his breakdown. The road to recovery wasn't easy, but Martin was determined to make it. There were setbacks, of course, days when the weight of his past became too much to bear, but he kept going. He had found a glimmer of hope in his recovery, and it was that hope that kept him moving forward. Sarah's phone rang one morning as she was preparing for another day at the trauma center. It was Martin. His voice was calm, but filled with emotion. "Sarah," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I wanted to thank you for giving me a chance. I'm starting to see that there's more to life than the darkness I've been carrying around. And I owe it to you and to Max." Sarah smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride for the man who had been through so much. "You're welcome, Martin," she replied. "You're doing the hard work now. You're finding your way back." "I'll get there," Martin said quietly. "I know it won't be easy, but I've got a second chance now. And I'm not going to waste it." The months passed, and both Max and Martin continued their respective journeys. Max grew stronger each day, adapting to his new life in the sanctuary. His once wary eyes softened with trust, and he became a symbol of resilience and loyalty for those around him. Martin, too, found healing in unexpected places. He slowly rebuilt his life, forging connections with others who had suffered similar pain. And while he knew the road ahead would be long, he was no longer alone. One bright afternoon, Sarah received a call from the sanctuary. They told her that Max had been adopted by a family who had fallen in love with his story. They wanted to give him the life he had always deserved: peaceful, filled with love, and free from the trauma of his past. As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Max had found the peace he deserved, and Martin was on his way to finding his own peace. The healing process was far from over, but both had been given a second chance. In the end, the story of Max and Martin reminds us that healing is not a straight path, but one that requires time, effort, and understanding. We all have our struggles, our past that may haunt us, and mistakes we've made, but it's never too late to make things right. Just like Max and Martin, we can find peace, redemption, and new beginnings, sometimes with the help of others, and sometimes by simply showing up for ourselves. This story teaches us the power of second chances, the importance of compassion, and the strength found in facing our own demons. It shows that no one is beyond redemption, and that the bonds we share, whether with animals or people, can be the catalyst for our own healing. As you reflect on this, take a moment to think about those around you who may be going through their own struggles. Sometimes all they need is a little support, a little faith. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that there is always hope, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own story of healing. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's spread kindness and understanding together. And as we all continue our own journeys, may God bless you with peace and strength. Amen.